Hey, Brit. I'm going to do a quick interview with you today. It's really great having you. We're going to be talking about business relocation incentives, kind of just to get awareness to people and kind of what's going on with this. So my first broad question is, in your understanding, what are business relocation incentives? How would you describe that?
Hi, Gabe. Thank you. Great question. And I think it means something different to different people. Incentives really are a reflection of a value system, and how you incentivize or what you incentivize and with what you incentivize, all are part of that discussion. And so typically incentives are thought, and I'm going to get back to I'm going to focus in a second, but just broadly speaking, incentives typically are thought of as some sort of monetary contribution, like, or a tax credit, or something along those lines. We use incentives in urban renewal districts, for example. We use public infrastructure as an incentive, paying for public infrastructure with public dollars as an incentive for development. But there are other incentives that I think don't get talked about enough, and those are a little bit harder to quantify because it's not a dollar figure. But an incentive to a business is retention of employees. And how do you achieve retention? Well, first of all, you have a really good culture at your workplace, right? A culture that people want to be around. But also, I think another incentive is quality of life for your employees. Where do you live? Where do they live? What do they like to do? Does the company support those values? And so, for example, in Montana, we don't have a lot of monetary incentives. We don't. That's just not a value and ethic that is over the years has been demonstrated here. We have other incentives though that I think are important to the business owner, and so those would be things like uh, employee loyalty. Why are they loyal? Well, they're loyal because your company has a great culture, and they're loyal because the Bozeman area, the Greater Gallatin Valley, is a great place to live. And so when you compare those two things, when you can pair them together, then I think you're creating an incentive for a business that's harder to quantify, but is no less important than a tax break.
Okay. I know that you're talking about like Montana does not do this monetary incentives, often done through tax credits, right? And I think like this is a very prevalent policy, maybe not in Montana, but in many like local areas. Why is the tax um the word isn't coming
The
up. Tax credits like
tax
such a
credit.
prevalent use in business relocation incentives.
Sure, and I'll give you a couple of examples. That's a really good question. But then I'm gonna sort of contradict myself in a minute. But I'll explain why. So typically, these tax credits are for a term, for some period of time, right? So, and sometimes it's zero until year 10 or something like that, or it's a staggered increase. So it's some percentage of between years 1 to 5, another an escalated percentage between years 6 and 10, and so on. And so there are these sort of graduated incentives, and typically the strategy is, well, we'll start a company off with not paying any property taxes, for example, but then by the time we get to year 10, they'll be paying the full freight of those property taxes. Well, what that does, in effect, is it incentivizes a company to start looking somewhere else. And so what we don't want to do is we don't want to invite companies here, try to help them get incorporated into the community, only to pick up stakes to go find the next incentive in another state, in another community, 5, 10 years later. That's not really good for the community. It hollows out the community in terms of their employee base, and so we don't want to get into that cycle of incentives in that way, because I don't think it ultimately it doesn't bode well. It works well for the company, but it doesn't work that great for the community. Now, I'm going to contradict myself briefly, but I'm going to give you a specific example. Uh, we have a burgeoning industry in Montana, and the pieces are starting to coalesce around film production, and incentivizing film, making more movies in Montana, for example. But you have to think of it, in my opinion, as an equation, right? And we're going to balance this equation. So there's the incentive side of the equation. Like, how do we get your attention? How do we get you interested? How do we get you to the state? But then there's the value add side, which is the infrastructure side of the equation. So recently, the legislature state legislature has increased the media. It's called the Media Act, and it's an acronym for something. But what it essentially is was a $10 million tax credit for film production companies bringing their movies to Montana. Well, that sounds like a lot of money to you and me. I mean, it is a lot of money, no doubt. But in the movie industry, when you think about what it takes to make a film, it's not that much. These movies cost some of them hundreds of millions, right? So this in this year's legislative session, there's a one of the state legislators, Wiley Galt, I think he's out of the Kalispell area, introduced raising the cap, the Media Act, to something like $250 million. Okay, that's a big incentive, right? That could help to incentivize multiple films, not just one, like it kind of does now. So that's great. I mean, that's moving forward. That's a real incentive that has some teeth and has a lot of value and has gotten a lot of attention. Now, but where we lack still in the state, although we're working on it, is the infrastructure side, right? So once they get here, once we entice them here with an incentive, how are we going to keep them here? And how are they going to continue to add value to their projects using Montana people, Montana studios, Montana lighting people, Montana editing people, Montana, grip and gaffers, and all the people that it takes to make a film. We want that side of the film production to be here as well. Not just we're going to come and shoot all your scenery, then we're going to take all our stuff to LA and we're going to add all the value there. That's not good for Montana. So but it's a long. I'm sorry, I'm getting a little long-winded here, Gabe. I will wrap it up by saying you have to have both. That's one example of how a tax incentive can be useful, but we still need to work on the other side, which is the infrastructure side.
Definitely, and I think this kind of like intersects. I actually read a paper about tax incentives for the film industry, which was pretty funny. Um, and one of the arguments that they made, it did while it did increase growth, like everything with taxes is kind of like a give and take, right? Because you're giving something, but that's also you're getting less revenue, right? Um, they while there was definitely an increase, and there was actually a little bit of retention after they let go. The increase wasn't as big as what they thought. So what you're saying is, if we do implement these, they have to be in tandem with something, right? Like we may want to increase our film tax credits for a few years, but we also need like the infrastructure to make sure that they stay there, and so we don't incentivize kind of like a hopping business, right? Businesses that's like, oh, we're going to like go to Gallatin Valley for a few years, and then they're going to move somewhere else for a few more years later, right?
Well, that's my opinion, Gabe. I mean, and you really encapsulated it quite well the way you described it. So I'll leave it at that. But yes, I mean that's the bottom line. The tax, we have property taxes in Montana, right? And so when you give someone a tax break, that means you're not funding the local government, the county government, and the schools. Those are the three legs of the funding structure, the three entities that receive our property tax dollars in Montana. And so when you're giving a tax break, that's what's not getting funded for some period of time, right? And so what I'm suggesting is that while that, I mean, go into that eyes wide open. We're trying to build an industry here, but we can't let all of the what I would call the value add, right? That's where the people come in and have expertise in all of the pieces and parts of the actual everything that happens after I shoot the film,
Hmm.
the B-roll, like all the B-roll or whatever. I need someone to put it all together to actually make the movie. That's the craft. We need that craft to stay in Montana.
Hmm.
There's a big value add there. There's lots of jobs. There's lots of good jobs that can be done anywhere in the state. So it's not a Western versus Eastern, an urban versus rural, or it doesn't have to be. I know some people frame it up that way, but I don't think it has to be that way. And so that's why I'm thinking that, in my opinion, it's both. It's both and not either or.
Hmm. Definitely. One kind of interesting, this is kind of taking a diversionary turn too, is kind of like who's actually implementing this policy, right? And one thing that I find, and you may not even know about this, but one thing that I kind of found interesting is a lot of the people who are implementing this policy, a lot of times it's like small mayoral style implements, and and there's actually a paper on this, and what they were saying is that the people actually kind of have have an effect on it. Do you think kind of the easy digestive, like how easy it is to digestive, oh, we're just giving them tax incentive to come here and work. Do you think that's a reason why kind of just throwing money at the problem is like a more popular idea instead of the slower, more gradual style of, oh, we can like increase infrastructure, we can make our community better? Do you think that's one of the reasons why just tax incentives are looked at more than kind of what you're more passionate about?
Well, that's another really good question, Gabe. Clearly, you've been looking into all this stuff. You know, the tax incentives that we discussed earlier are important. They're what gets people's attention. And some production companies are perfectly capable and resourced enough to come in, shoot the movies, and go away. And but that's just leaving a lot on the table, frankly. Right? That's leaving a lot of jobs, a lot of potential income, a lot of and hell, even more. And there are these knock-on effects. So let's say, for example, you start to really build some momentum in the film industry, and people that live. I'm just going to use Bozeman as an example because that's what I know best. And the people that live in Bozeman that work in the film industry, of which there are many in a lot of different areas, um, half the year they're working here, the other half they're working in LA. Well, if we could keep them here for the whole year and still do what they do, then that's a whole year that they're spending money on groceries, a whole year that they're spending money on entertainment, right? It has these compounding effects that are difficult to quantify, sort of when you're talking about it in the big picture. But I think most of us can recognize when you start kind of peeling the onion back a little bit, why having um, talent and skills and expertise in the state is really important to our overall health of our overall economy.
Okay. Well, thank you, Brett, for coming. This is just a really short interview. We could talk about this all day. I just want to thank you, and
My pleasure. Thank you, Gabe.
thanks.